The flames flickered high, casting restless shadows against the earthen walls of the Dakota village. Smoke twisted into the night, curling around the council lodge where men sat in a solemn circle, their faces painted with red ochre and grief. Outside, the wind carried whispers of vengeance, the cries of the fallen still echoing in the memory of those left behind. Thaopi Ska stood motionless, his arms crossed over his broad chest, a figure carved from the land itself. His name, White Wound, had been given to him not for his scars but for the pain he carried, the sorrow that ran as deep as the Missouri River. Tonight, that burden grew heavier. The warriors who returned from the raid had brought back something unexpected, a settler girl, a survivor from the massacre at the trading post. "She must die," growled Matowakheng, his voice like distant thunder. "Her people spilled our blood. We spill theirs." The others nodded, murmuring their agreement. The decision was as old as war itself. Blood for blood. Thaopi Ska said nothing, his dark eyes fixed on the fire. "They would not spare our women," another elder spat. "Why should we spare theirs?" Beyond the council lodge, bound to a wooden post in the dirt, the girl watched them through strands of tangled blonde hair. She had not wept. She had not begged. Her blue eyes, though rimmed red with exhaustion, held only defiance. Eleanor Carter, 18 years old, had witnessed the slaughter of her family with her own eyes. The bodies of her father and mother still lay stiff and broken on the floor of the burned-out trading post, alongside the other settlers who had thought they could carve a new life out of stolen land. The war had come too fast, too brutal. The treaties meant nothing. The law of the frontier was simple, only the strongest survived. But she had not expected to be taken. She had expected to die with them. Now, as she stood in the heart of the village, surrounded by men who wanted her blood, she lifted her chin. If they meant to kill her, she would not cower. She had seen her father fight until his last breath. She would do the same. Thaopi Ska turned his gaze to her, and in the flickering light, something unreadable passed through his expression. He saw it, the way she clenched her fists though her hands trembled, the tight set of her jaw even as a trickle of blood ran from a split lip. She was a child in the eyes of many, yet she did not shrink. "She does not deserve mercy," Matowakheng pressed, his voice sharp. "Give the order." The fire crackled, sending up a spray of embers. The girl's breath came in slow, measured beats, though her pulse raced like a trapped bird. She had seen men die before. She had seen their eyes when they realized the end had come. But this man, the one who stood apart, the one the warriors looked to, he had not yet spoken her fate. Thaopi Ska exhaled. He could feel the weight of the past pressing against his ribs. He had seen too much killing. He had lost too many. His people had suffered at the hands of the settlers, yes, but he had also seen kindness in unexpected places. He remembered the soldier he had once spared, a boy not much older than this girl, and how that decision had cost him the trust of his men. But even now, even with the blood shed fresh in their minds, something within him resisted the call for vengeance. He took a step forward. The warriors watched, waiting. The girl's eyes did not leave him. Thaopi reached for the knife at his belt. A blade meant for mercy. A swift death. The girl tensed. He lifted it. Then, without a word, he cut through the rope that bound her hand. A hush fell over the village. The girl staggered, but she did not fall. Gasp. Whispers. The murmurs swelled into angry voices. Matowakheng stepped forward, fury in his stance. "What are you doing?" Thaopi turned to him, his expression unreadable. "Enough death," he said simply. Mato's hand dropped to the hatchet at his waist. "She is one of them. She is a child," Thaopi said. "And I will not stain my hands with her blood." Silence stretched between them, thick as the smoke that curled around them. Then, movement. A warrior lunged. Eli barely had time to react before Thaopi moved. He caught the man's wrist, twisting it sharply. The hatchet fell to the ground. A heartbeat later, Thaopi shoved him back, sending him sprawling into the dirt. Another warrior stepped forward. Then another. Thaopi stood his ground, eyes dark as storm clouds. Who among you will challenge me? None did. Not yet. Matawaking's gaze burned with anger. You dishonor your people, he spat. Thaopi turned back to the girl. You will come with me. Ellie did not move. She did not trust him, not yet. But she understood one thing, if she stayed, she would die. Slowly, she nodded. Thaopi placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her away from the post. The crowd parted, but their eyes burned with resentment. Night stretched over the land as they left the village behind. They rode in silence, the girl seated behind him on his horse, her fingers clutching at his belt. She was weak, exhausted. He could feel the way she fought to stay upright. He did not look back, but he knew the warriors would follow soon. He had bought them time, nothing more. They reached the river just before dawn. The water ran fast and cold, reflecting the pale light of the rising sun. Thaopi dismounted, pulling Ellie down with him. Cross, he told her. She hesitated. You expect me to trust you? No, he stepped into the water first, the freezing current biting at his legs. But if you want to live, you will follow. She looked back, saw the shadows moving along the ridge. Their pursuers were close. Gritting her teeth, she stepped into the river. The current nearly took her, but strong hands grabbed her, pulling her against him. Hold on. Then he pushed forward, the water rising higher, threatening to drag them under. Ellie clung to him, her breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. Behind them, the war cries began. Arrows cut through the air. One struck the water beside them. Another whistled past Ellie's ear. Thaopi moved faster, his grip ironclad. They reached the other side, stumbling onto the rocky shore. Ellie collapsed, coughing. She turned back just in time to see their pursuers halt at the river's edge. The warriors did not cross. Not yet. Thaopi pulled her to her feet. We keep moving. Ellie looked at him, her breath ragged. For the first time, she saw something in his eyes. Not cruelty. Not indifference. Something else. She did not know what it was. Not yet. But she followed. The night pressed against them, thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. The river still roared behind them, swallowing the echoes of war cries that had chased them to the shore. Ellie's body trembled, not just from the cold that clung to her skin but from the sheer exhaustion that weighed her down. Yet, she forced herself to move, to match Thaopi's unrelenting pace as they wove deeper into the wild. Her legs ached. Every step sent pain lancing through her feet, but she bit her tongue. She had seen what happened to those who fell behind. She had learned long ago that weakness was an invitation to death. Thaopi walked ahead, his movements as fluid as the wind rustling through the trees. He did not turn to look at her, but he knew. He could hear her stagger, the way her breath hitched as she struggled to keep up. He should not have cared. She was not his responsibility. And yet, here she was. Here he was. He slowed. Just enough. Ellie noticed but said nothing. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of knowing how desperately she needed the reprieve. The night stretched on, endless, and the forest swallowed them whole. The moon barely touched the earth here, the canopy above thick with the towering embrace of ancient pines. Every sound was magnified. The snap of a branch, the distant howl of a coyote, the whisper of something unseen moving just beyond the trees. Ellie shuddered but kept moving. Then, abruptly, Thaopi raised a hand. She froze. He listened. Not just with his ears, but with something deeper, something honed by years of survival. A moment passed. Then another. Finally, he exhaled. We stop here. Ellie nearly collapsed where she stood. Thaopi moved quickly, gathering dry branches, pulling flint from a pouch at his waist. Sparks flew, and moments later, a small fire crackled between them, casting flickering light against the darkness. Ellie sat, pulling her knees to her chest. Her wet clothes clung to her like a second skin, and she forced her numb fingers to untie her soaked boots. The warmth of the fire was a fragile mercy, but she took it. Across from her, Thaopi watched. She had seen men like him before. Men who did not speak unless words served a purpose. Men who carried violence in their bones yet held themselves with an unsettling stillness. He was unlike the others in the village, though. They had wanted her dead. He had stopped them. Ellie studied him now in the firelight, tracing the sharp angles of his face, the dark eyes that never lingered too long, the way he carried himself, always ready, always waiting. Finally she spoke. Why? He didn't move. Why what? Why did you stop them? Silence stretched between them. The fire crackled, the wood shifting. Thaopi did not look at her when he answered. Enough blood has been spilled. Ellie let out a bitter laugh. That's it. He did not answer. She shook her head. Your people think I deserve to die. That I'm the enemy. Thaopi's gaze lifted then, steady and unreadable. Are you? Ellie opened her mouth, then hesitated. Was she? Her father had traded with the Lakota, had tried to live alongside them, but she had heard the whispers. She had seen the fear in the settlers' eyes when warriors passed through town. She had heard the stories. Stories of raids, of scalps taken, of families slaughtered in the dead of night. And yet, when the soldiers came, when they took land that was not theirs, when they burned villages and killed without mercy, they did not call it murder. They called it justice. Ellie swallowed hard. I didn't choose this war, she said finally. Thaopi held her gaze. Neither did I. They sat in silence. The night stretched on, vast and indifferent. Ellie shivered again, pulling her arms tighter around herself. Thaopi stood without a word and disappeared into the trees. She stiffened. Was he leaving her? Had he changed his mind? Then, rustling. Moments later, he returned, carrying a bundle of furs. Without a word, he tossed one toward her. She hesitated before pulling it around her shoulders, the scent of earth and smoke settling over her like a ghost of warmth. Thank you, she murmured. Thaopi said nothing. They did not speak again that night. Dawn came with the mournful cry of a hawk overhead. Ellie woke to the smell of damp leaves and burning embers. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then she saw him. Thaopi stood near the edge of the trees, his back to her, watching the world with the quiet patience of a predator. He turned slightly when she stirred. Eat. She looked down and found a strip of dried meat near the fire. Hunger clawed at her stomach, but she hesitated. Thaopi crouched beside the fire, tearing into his own portion without ceremony. It is not poisoned, he said dryly. Ellie shot him a glare before taking a cautious bite. The meat was tough, but it was food. They ate in silence. Then, without warning, he spoke. They will not stop hunting us. Ellie swallowed hard. She had known, of course. She had seen the way the warriors had watched them leave, the anger burning in their eyes. But hearing him say it made it real. Thaopi met her gaze. If you go east, you might make it to the forts. Ellie stilled. If I go east, she said slowly, they'll find me before I ever get there. Thaopi did not argue. She studied him, the way his jaw tightened, the flicker of something almost like frustration behind his eyes. You don't have a plan, do you? He exhaled through his nose. You talk too much. Ellie scoffed. And you don't talk enough. A ghost of a smirk. Gone in an instant. Then, a shift in the wind. Thaopi stood abruptly, his hand resting lightly on the knife at his hip. Ellie felt it too, something in the air, something just beyond sight. Then, movement. A figure stepped from the trees. Mato Wakheng. Ellie's breath caught. He was alone, but that meant nothing. The others would not be far. Thaopi did not move, did not reach for his weapon. Yet, there was something dangerous in his stillness. Mato's gaze flicked to Ellie. You should have let her die. Thaopi's voice was steady. I made my choice. Mato studied him for a long moment. So have I. Then he turned and disappeared into the trees. Ellie's hands clenched. That was a warning. Thaopi nodded. We ride. Ellie scrambled to her feet, dread twisting in her gut. They mounted the horse in silence, and as they rode, Ellie cast one last glance over her shoulder. The trees stood still. The forest watched. But she knew. They were not alone. And the hunt had begun. The wind carried the scent of rain and blood. Thaopi Ska rode hard, the rhythm of the horse's hooves drumming against the earth like the pounding of war drums. Ellie clung to him, her fingers digging into the leather of his vest, her breath ragged in his ear. The forest blurred past them, shadows twisting in the pre-dawn gloom. They had no destination, only the urgency of escape. Behind them, the hunt had begun. Ellie turned her head, heart hammering against her ribs. She couldn't see them yet, but she knew they were there, moving like ghosts through the trees, relentless in their pursuit. Thaopi made no sound, but she felt the tension in his body, the way his grip tightened on the reins. He was listening, sensing, calculating. Then, a sharp whistle cut through the air. Thaopi yanked the horse sideways just as an arrow sliced past, embedding itself into the tree beside them. The animal reared, screaming in panic. Ellie lost her grip, slipping from the saddle. The ground hit hard, knocking the breath from her lungs. Her vision swam, pain blooming along her ribs. No time. She scrambled to her feet, searching wildly. Thaopi had already dismounted, his knife flashing in his hand. Matowakheng emerged from trees. Not alone. 2 warriors flanked him, their bows raised, their faces unreadable in the dim light. Thaopi did not move. He did not speak. But Ellie saw the way his stance shifted, the way his fingers flexed around the hilt of his blade. Mato stepped forward, his voice quiet, almost gentle. "It does not have to be this way." Thaopi's jaw tightened. Ellie swallowed hard. The air between them was a taut wire, ready to snap. Mato sighed, his gaze flicking to her. "You are a fool, white girl. You should have died that night." Ellie's fists clenched, but she said nothing. Mato turned back to Thaopi. "You shame yourself. You shame the dead." Thaopi did not answer. Then Mato lifted his hand. A signal. The first warrior moved, swift as a striking snake. An arrow knocked and loosed in a single breath. Thaopi lunged, shoving Ellie aside. The arrow hissed past, close enough that she felt the wind of it against her cheek. Then chaos. Thaopi was on them, his knife flashing, carving through the space between them. The first warrior twisted, barely avoiding the strike, his own blade flashing in response. Ellie hit the ground hard, rolling onto her knees, heart hammering. Another arrow. She ducked, her hands scrabbling for something, anything. Then she saw it. A fallen branch, thick and gnarled. No time to think. She grabbed it, lunging upward, swinging wild and hard. It connected with the second warrior's ribs. He let out a sharp grunt, staggering back. Thaopi saw the opening. He moved like lightning, his knife finding its mark. A choked gasp, then the warrior crumpled. Mato snarled, drawing his own blade. "Traitor!" Thaopi said nothing. They circled each other, the fire of old hatred burning between them. Ellie scrambled backward, breathless, blood pounding in her ears. Mato struck first. A quick, brutal slash. Thaopi blocked it, the clash of steel ringing through the clearing. Ellie's fingers tightened around the branch. She had no illusions about her place in this fight. If she got in the way, she would die. But if she did nothing, Thaopi would die. And for reasons she could not explain, she could not allow that. Mato lunged again, forcing Thaopi back. Then Ellie saw it, the faintest shift in Mato's stance, the opening he left behind. She moved without thinking, drove the branch forward, aiming for his knee. It was not a killing blow, but it was enough. Mato stumbled. Thaopi did not hesitate. The knife struck true. Mato let out a sharp breath, his eyes wide with something like disbelief. Then he fell. Silence. The forest held its breath. Ellie stared at the body, her pulse roaring in her ears. Thaopi stood over him, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he turned to look at her. She was still gripping the branch, her knuckles white. "You killed him," she breathed. Thaopi shook his head. "We killed him." She swallowed, her throat dry. Then the sound of hooves. More were coming. No time. Thaopi grabbed her wrist, pulling her toward the horse. Ellie did not resist. They mounted, and with a sharp command, the animal bolted forward. The wind tore at her hair, her skin. The hunt was not over. But for now they were still breathing.